The year is 1623. A woman kneels in the town square. Her head is locked in iron. She can hear the crowd whispering, but she can't answer. The metal bites deeper every time she tries to speak. Another stands in the marketplace, hair shorn to the scalp, chains dragging in the dust. People stare. Some spit. Her crime? No one even remembers. For centuries, punishments like these weren't hidden in dungeons. They were public theater, written into law, performed for crowds, and every act was a message. This is what happens when a woman steps out of line. What you're about to see is not fiction. These are the most grotesque punishments ever used on women in history, and every one is more disturbing than the last. In early modern Europe, speaking your mind could cost you more than your reputation. It could cost you the ability to speak at all. The scold's bridle, also known as the brank, was a device made of iron, shaped like a cage that locked over a woman's head. A flat metal plate sat inside the mouth, pressing down on the tongue. The idea was simple: silence. Officials claimed it was meant for nagging wives or public scolds, women accused of gossiping, arguing, or simply talking too much in public. In reality, it was a weapon for silencing dissent, often used on women who criticized local authorities, refused to comply with husbands, or publicly challenged men. The humiliation was part of the punishment. Women were paraded through town wearing the bridle, the iron biting into their skin, their inability to speak turning them into living cautionary tales. Some bridles even had sharp spikes on the tongue plate, so if the wearer tried to move her tongue, she'd stab herself from the inside. This wasn't just about stopping words, it was about making the act of thinking about speaking physically painful. And here's the disturbing part. These devices were officially sanctioned. Town records from Scotland, England, and parts of Germany list scold's bridles in inventories of public punishments, right alongside stocks and whipping posts. If the scold's bridle was about silencing, the breast ripper was about erasing. Used primarily during the medieval and early modern periods, this iron tool looked almost like a claw or gardening rake, except the pruning it did was human flesh. It was heated until red hot, then clamped around the breasts of women accused of adultery, infanticide, heresy, or even in some recorded cases, witchcraft. The official reasoning? These crimes dishonored the body, so the body should bear the punishment. The logic was twisted beyond belief. Mutilation as morality. Sometimes the ripper was designed with 4 prongs, tearing away the flesh in one brutal pull. Other times, the device was dragged across the skin, shredding everything in its path. Survivors, rare as they were permanently scarred and often died later from infection. And yet, executioners didn't even hide these punishments. Public squares saw these acts carried out in front of crowds, turning pain into spectacle. One chilling court record from Bavaria in the 16th century lists the sentence of a woman accused of killing her newborn. Her breasts shall be torn with the iron claws, and she shall be burned to death at the stake. The breast ripper wasn't just about execution, it was about erasing femininity as a form of punishment. Sometimes, cruelty didn't need fire or steel, just water and public humiliation. The ducking stool was a chair attached to a long wooden beam, mounted over a pond or river. The condemned, almost always women accused of disorderly conduct or scolding, would be strapped in and dunked repeatedly underwater. The idea was part punishment, part public entertainment. Townspeople gathered along the banks, jeering as the chair swung down into the water and yanked back up again. Records from the 17th century showed ducking sessions lasting for hours. Women were dunked over and over until exhaustion, hypothermia, or drowning ended it. And here's the bitter irony. The ducking stool was often described as a correctional tool, as if forcing someone to inhale half a river was just another kind of discipline. One of the last recorded uses in England happened in 1817, when a woman named Sarah Leakey was ducked in Leominster for brawling with her neighbors. By then, the punishment was already considered old-fashioned, But that didn't stop locals from turning it into a public event. Across early modern Europe, confessions weren't always spoken. Sometimes they were screamed. The Spanish chair was a wooden seat fitted with sharp iron spikes along the back, arms, legs, and sometimes even the seat itself. Women accused of crimes ranging from theft to heresy could be strapped in tightly, forcing the spikes into their flesh. Sometimes, executioners heated the iron spikes before seating the victim, turning the chair into both a restraint and a branding device. This wasn't punishment after conviction, it was a method to get the conviction. Authorities justified it as a way to extract truth from unwilling suspects. In Spain and parts of Italy, the chair was used not just in criminal cases, but in moral ones, including accusations of sexual misconduct, blasphemy, or witchcraft. One surviving example, kept in a museum in Ghent, Belgium, has over 1,500 metal points and heavy iron bars to keep the victim immobile. The goal wasn't to kill immediately, it was to hold someone in unbearable pain for hours or days until they confessed to whatever the court wanted to hear. Not all punishments were bloody, but that didn't make them less damaging. In many parts of Europe, the Middle East and Asia, convicted women were marched through the streets in shaming parades. Heads were shaved, clothes torn, sometimes bodies smeared with filth or ash. The goal wasn't physical destruction, it was social death. A woman seen in such a parade could lose her marriage, her livelihood, and any hope of public trust. In medieval France, adulteresses were forced to walk barefoot through the streets, wearing only a thin shift, carrying a torch, while church bells rang to announce their disgrace. In Qing dynasty China, public shaming for immoral women could include being caged and displayed at marketplaces, with a placard listing their crimes. These punishments relied on one of the most powerful tools of control in history, the community's collective memory. Scars fade, but reputations destroyed in public spectacle could last a lifetime. In Imperial China, foot binding wasn't officially listed as a punishment in the law books, but for millions of women, it became a lifelong prison sentence. The practice began among elite families during the Song dynasty and spread through society over the centuries. Girls as young as 4 had their feet broken, the arches crushed, and toes folded under toward the sole. The bindings were tightened regularly, forcing the feet into an unnatural curve no longer than 10 centimeters, what was called the golden lotus. While often presented as a sign of beauty and high status, foot binding also functioned as a control mechanism. Bound feet limited mobility, making it nearly impossible for women to walk long distances, work independently, or escape unwanted marriages. In certain regions, foot binding was weaponized deliberately. Families could bind the feet of daughters as a form of punishment for disobedience, cutting off their ability to leave the household. Historical records from the Qing period describe women punished for infidelity by being rebound after marriage, even if they had already suffered through the process as children. The bones of adult feet were broken again, an agony described in one account as worse than the pain of childbirth, but without the hope of an ending. Foot binding wasn't a single moment of cruelty, it was decades of daily pain, infection, and disability. For some, it was a death sentence delivered in silk ribbons. Medieval Europe saw its share of devices designed for maximum discomfort, but the pear of anguish stands out for its cruel precision. This metal instrument, shaped roughly like a pear, had 4 segmented petals controlled by a screw mechanism. Inserted into the mouth, vagina, or rectum, the pear would expand as the screw turned, stretching the orifice far beyond natural limits. For women, the most common use was as punishment for accusations of adultery, witchcraft, or immorality. In some cases, it was used during interrogations to silence prisoners who screamed too loudly. 17th century French criminal inventory lists multiple versions of the pear, some with sharp edges on the petals, others smooth. The sharper variants could tear soft tissue, causing massive bleeding. The expanding mechanism meant the pear could be adjusted slowly, prolonging the agony for hours. Survivors risked permanent internal damage, infection, and death. While some historians debate how widespread the pair's use actually was, museum examples exist across Europe, each with slight variations. Whether used frequently or not, the fact that such a device was designed at all reveals the twisted ingenuity of historical torture. Across various cultures, drowning has been a preferred method of execution for centuries. But for women accused of certain crimes, the drowning came with an added cruelty: confinement in a sack. In ancient Rome, the punishment of poena culli, penalty of the sack, was typically for parricide, but in some cases adapted for women convicted of infanticide or witchcraft. The condemned would be sewn into a leather sack, sometimes along with live animals such as snakes or roosters, before being thrown into a body of water. In parts of medieval Germany and the Low Countries, a similar method was used specifically for women accused of killing their husbands. Town chronicles describe the execution of the woman Greta in Lübeck, who was bound in a sack and cast into the sea before the eyes of all. The logic was ritualistic as much as punitive. Water was seen as a cleansing element, and death by drowning symbolically washed away the crime. But the sack meant there was no escape, no chance of survival. Once thrown in, the water closed over without a ripple of hope. Before police records and mugshots, the human body itself became the criminal record. Branding, burning a mark into the skin with a heated iron, was common in many societies, but certain codes applied specifically to women. In 17th and 18th century France, women convicted of theft could be branded with a fleur-de-lis on the shoulder. In England, the letter A could be seared into the flesh of adulteresses, a real-life counterpart to the fictional punishment in the Scarlet Letter. In colonial North America, branding was sometimes combined with whipping, turning the act into both a physical and public humiliation. Court records from Virginia in 1751 detail a woman branded with B for board, the archaic term for a woman running a brothel after she refused to pay a fine. Unlike some punishments, branding was permanent. The scar remained as a visible warning to others, a lifelong sentence without prison walls. Not all punishments spilled blood, some drained the spirit instead. In Catholic Europe, women accused of moral crimes such as adultery, prostitution, or illegitimate pregnancy could be sentenced to confinement in convents. On the surface, these were houses of repentance, places for reflection and reform. In reality, they were prisons in all but name. Women were cut off from the outside world, forced into strict labor routines, and subjected to constant religious instruction. In some cases, they were forbidden from speaking for weeks or months at a time. By the 18th and 19th centuries, secular authorities adopted a similar model in the form of workhouses and Magdalene laundries. These institutions, operating in countries like Ireland, Britain, and Australia, took in women deemed fallen and put them to work in grueling conditions. Survivors described endless hours of washing, sewing, and cleaning under harsh supervision, with little food and no wages. Many spent decades inside for no crime greater than being poor, pregnant, or accused of immorality. One Irish survivor of a Magdalene laundry, interviewed in the late 20th century, recalled, "They told me it was for my own good. I left 30 years later with nothing but my hands raw from washing." Flogging was a common punishment for both men and women, but its public application carried a special weight for women in tightly controlled societies. Tied to a whipping post or pillory, the woman would be lashed with a whip or rod, often on the bare back. In some cases, clothing was stripped from the waist up to increase shame, drawing a crowd eager for spectacle. In Puritan New England, whipping could be a sentence for everything from theft to loose behavior. A 1656 court record from Massachusetts describes a woman publicly whipped for lascivious carriage, a phrase so vague it could mean almost anything from flirtation to adultery. In the Caribbean under colonial rule, enslaved women faced the whipping post as both punishment and control. Whippings could be ordered by owners for perceived disobedience, and the cruelty was often intensified by targeting areas of the body meant to humiliate as well as injure. The chastity belt has become one of the most infamous symbols of medieval control over women. A locked metal device, allegedly worn to prevent sexual activity during a husband's absence. For years, popular imagination painted it as a torture device worn for months or years. But historians now point out that many surviving chastity belts in museums are 19th century fakes, created as curiosities rather than functional restraints. That said, the idea of the chastity belt was very real, and there are credible cases of similar restraint devices being used. Some were made of leather reinforced with iron, others entirely of metal, secured with a padlock or intricate clasp. In the rare historical accounts that describe them, chastity devices were most often used as a temporary form of control to prevent rape in wartime, to restrain enslaved women during transport, or to protect a bride before a politically arranged marriage. The cruelty wasn't always in the device itself, but in the implications. It made the woman's body a guarded possession, her autonomy literally under lock and key. When imprisonment wasn't enough, food or the lack of it became a weapon. In some medieval European prisons, women convicted of moral crimes were placed on punishment diets, surviving on bread and water alone for weeks. The goal wasn't just physical weakness, but spiritual purification. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, forced feeding became a brutal response to hunger strikes, particularly among imprisoned suffragettes in Britain and America. Women who refused food in protest were strapped into chairs, while rubber tubes were forced through their noses or mouths into the stomach. Prison doctors often used oversized tubes or deliberately rough handling to break the will of the strikers. Eyewitness accounts describe bleeding, vomiting, and long-term damage to the throat and stomach. On the other side of the spectrum, starvation itself was used as a silent execution method. In certain workhouses and penal colonies, food rations could be reduced until death occurred naturally, leaving little evidence of direct violence. While the ducking stool is often associated with Europe, similar punishments appeared across Asia and the Middle East, each adapted to local customs and geography. In 17th century Japan, misubuse involved binding the accused and submerging them in rivers or wells. Sometimes it was an interrogation method. The victim would be held underwater until near unconsciousness, then pulled up for questioning before being submerged again. In parts of the Ottoman Empire, women accused of adultery could face sudavasa, water trial, where they were tied inside a wooden frame and lowered into the Bosphorus or a local harbor. Death wasn't guaranteed, but the intention was clear: frighten, punish, and shame in front of the community. These methods carried a dual message. Not only was the accused physically punished, but her uncontrolled nature was symbolically cooled by the water, reflecting a belief that female misconduct was a form of dangerous heat needing to be extinguished. Hair might seem trivial compared to the horrors of iron spikes or branding, but in many societies, it carried deep cultural meaning. Removing it could be a punishment as psychologically devastating as physical torture. In ancient Greece and Rome, enslaved women could have their hair cut as a sign of punishment or sale, stripping away markers of status or beauty. In some medieval convents, nuns accused of breaking their vows were forcibly tonsured, their hair shaved in a ritual of disgrace. During World War II, public head shaving became a common punishment for women accused of collaborating with occupying forces. In France, after liberation, thousands of women, many of them accused, some entirely innocent, were dragged into public squares, their heads shaved as crowds jeered. The act wasn't just about marking someone, it was about removing the right to be anonymous. With every glance from a neighbor or stranger, the punishment renewed itself. In England and colonial America, a legal process called peine forte et dure, strong and hard punishment, was reserved for those who refused to plead in court. The accused would be laid on the ground, a board placed on the body, and stones or iron weights added until they agreed to plead or died. While most cases involved men, There are recorded instances of women being pressed to death. In 1444, a woman named Juliana Quick was executed this way in England after refusing to plead to a charge of petty treason, the murder of her husband. In Mughal India, a similar method existed for certain crimes. Heavy stones were stacked on the chest and limbs until bones cracked and breathing stopped. This was particularly used in regions where execution by beheading was considered dishonorable for women. Crushing punishments carried a slow inevitability, each added weight, a reminder that time and air were running out. They left no spectacular spectacle for the crowd, just the quiet, horrifying certainty of what was coming. In early modern Europe, women convicted of theft, repeated drunkenness, or wandering without purpose could be locked into heavy iron collars. Some collars were simple hoops with a padlock. Others were elaborate neck cages with spikes pressing into the skin. The collars might be chained to walls, posts, or even worn during forced labor in public. In 18th century Russia, iron collars were a common punishment for women in Siberian penal colonies. Records describe collars weighing several kilograms, worn day and night for months. The constant strain caused open sores and long-term spinal damage. A variation existed in parts of West Africa, where iron neck rings often used for enslaved women were fitted so tightly that removal required breaking the ring itself. For some, the punishment was permanent. The collar became both a mark of shame and a physical reminder of captivity. Public shaming has many forms, but in cities from medieval Europe to colonial Asia, the chain parade turned humiliation into a moving spectacle. Women convicted of theft, adultery, or defying local laws could be shackled in heavy iron chains and forced to walk through crowded streets. The route often passed through marketplaces, taverns, or church squares, anywhere large groups would gather to watch. In 15th century Florence, court records describe women convicted of sex work walking barefoot in iron shackles, with a guard striking a drum to draw attention. The chains were deliberately long, so they dragged noisily over cobblestones, announcing the punishment before the crowd even saw the condemned. In Mughal India, a similar method was used for certain thefts. The accused was marched through the bazaar at peak hours, neck locked in an iron yoke and wrists bound with rope. It wasn't about transportation, it was about branding the offender in the collective memory of the community. While burning at the stake is often associated with witch trials, it was used in many societies as a legal punishment for women in particular. In medieval Europe, women convicted of high treason, petty treason, such as killing a husband or master, heresy, or certain forms of witchcraft, could be sentenced to death by fire. The reasoning was partly symbolic. Fire was seen as cleansing the soul and destroying the body without leaving it to be buried in consecrated ground. In England, until the late 18th century, women convicted of petty treason were burned rather than hanged. Officials claimed it was to preserve modesty. Hanging could expose the body in undignified ways, but in reality, burning was a far slower, more agonizing death. In some cases, the executioner would strangle the condemned woman before the flames reached her, a small mercy not guaranteed in law. One of the last recorded cases was Catherine Murphy in 1789, executed for coining, counterfeiting, officially by burning, but strangled beforehand. Outside Europe, similar punishments existed. In certain regions of Southeast Asia, immolation was used for royal concubines accused of betrayal, framed as an honorable death that avoided the spilling of royal blood. Punishment wasn't always about physical harm sometimes. The violation was in stripping away all privacy. In 1903, century colonial outposts across India, Africa, and the Pacific, women accused of prostitution could be subjected to compulsory medical examinations under contagious diseases laws. The stated aim was to control venereal disease. The reality was state-sanctioned public humiliation. The examinations were often conducted by male doctors, sometimes in open hospital wards or police stations, with other officers present. Women who refused could be forcibly restrained. In Victorian Britain, campaigner Josephine Butler documented dozens of cases where women, some never charged with any crime, were held down and examined in degrading conditions. Even if found clean, the social stigma of having undergone such an examination often destroyed reputations. In earlier centuries, such invasive inspections also appeared in witchcraft trials, where searchers, often midwives or surgeons, examined accused women for a witch's mark. This could involve stripping in front of court officials and having every inch of skin inspected. The idea of bodily integrity simply didn't exist when the state wanted proof. Sometimes the most devastating punishments left no wounds at all. In many cultures, banishment, permanent removal from one's home, was considered worse than death. In ancient Athens, exile, fige, could be imposed on women for crimes including poisoning, temple theft, or adultery. While men might rebuild lives elsewhere, women's economic and social dependence on family meant exile often led to destitution or death. In colonial Australia, female convicts deemed incorrigible could be sent to remote penal settlements, cut off from the mainland entirely. In 17th century Japan, kumi hanshi, expulsion from one's village, was used as punishment for women accused of bringing dishonor to their community. This could mean sleeping rough, begging, or entering dangerous forms of labor just to survive. Exile wasn't just a change of address, it was a social death, erasing all ties, protection, and identity. In societies where survival depended on belonging, banishment could be a slow-motion execution, breaking on the wheel, the rare but final punishment. Though rare for women, there are documented cases of the wheel being used as the ultimate public punishment. In this method, the condemned was tied to a large wooden cartwheel, limbs splayed. The executioner would then strike the arms and legs with an iron bar, breaking bones one by one before delivering a fatal blow. For women, this was generally reserved for crimes considered beyond all redemption: infanticide, serial theft, or multiple murders. In 1744, Maria Katharina Wächter of Württemberg was executed by the wheel after being convicted of poisoning her husband and several children. The wheel was both execution and display. The broken body was sometimes left on the wheel for days as a warning to others. It was a punishment designed to be unforgettable, not just for the victim, but for everyone who saw it. Looking back at these punishments, the methods vary wildly: fire, iron, water, starvation, exile. Some killed instantly, others took hours or years. But there's a through line. Again and again, these punishments didn't just aim to inflict pain, they aimed to control narrative and reputation. Silencing with a bridle wasn't just about stopping words, it was about telling the town who was allowed to speak. Shaving a head or parading in chains wasn't just about humiliation. It was about writing a permanent story onto the body. In most cases, the crime didn't need to be proven beyond doubt. The accusation was enough, because the punishment itself erased the accused woman's ability to defend herself in society afterward. These weren't just tools of justice, they were tools of power, and they worked by making examples, turning individual suffering into a public performance meant to keep others in line. Today, the devices may be gone, but the logic behind them still echoes. When control is the goal, the body becomes the battlefield. And history is proof that once a society justifies cruelty as order, there's no limit to the imagination that follows.